So all too often, we are told to separate things. We separate understanding from joy, separate faith from certainty, separate male from female, work from play, reality from fantasy, science from imagination, even young from old. And often in church, we separate things too. Often when we preach up here, we focus just on the gospel, just the stories of Jesus, without actually grounding them in the rich tapestry of the Jewish Torah, or what Christians often call the Old Testament. We call it the Old Testament because we think of that as the first revelation from God. That was a covenant that started with the creation, proceeded through the rainbow, given to us after the great flood. That rainbow established, I think my mic died. No, it's still going? Okay. That rainbow established a relationship between God and humankind and led to the second covenant seen in the New Testament, in the second kind of rainbow of Jesus. Jesus Christ, the one who came to be with us. The rainbow came down to earth. So there's a rainbow connection there between the old and the new. So today, let's not separate things. Let's actually not pry apart the stories. I'm going to talk about all the texts we read today. Don't worry, I won't be too long. So first, let's touch on Proverbs, the piece read by Anne there, the famous woman of valor proverb. The capable wife who can find. She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her. Her children rise up and call her blessed. So she's a great wife and mother, but she's not some pushover. She's not a shrinking violet. She is a capable businesswoman. She's strong, influential, powerful in her community. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hand, she plants a vineyard. She girds herself with strength. She looks to the ways of her household. And the praise of people like her is echoed in the psalm we heard today as well. The righteous are trees planted by streams of water. Everything they do shall prosper. The proverb goes on to say, strength and dignity are her clothing. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is always on her tongue. I'd like to think that Christ himself modeled his behavior after this woman. The teaching of kindness always on her tongue. So in honor of this amazing woman, and some deep-thinking theologians like Sally McFay, Elizabeth Johnson, and even Walter Raschenbuch, who describe God as a great mother, I'm going to refer to Christ as she throughout the sermon. Because our youth recently asked in Sunday school, they said, well, why is God put Jesus here as male? Why does God have to be him? Good question. So let's call Jesus she. Let's go with Christ as feminine, see how that changes things. What does she do in this Gospel of Mark? First, she asks her disciples, what are you arguing about? And the disciples don't really have a good answer. They're kind of being mini Trumps. They're like, who's the greatest? I've seen the most miracles. Well, I passed out the greatest number of loaves and fishes. I have the biggest crowds. Jesus knew. She knew what was going on. So she calls them over and she says, whoever wants to be first must be last. And then she takes a little child and says to them, whoever welcomes a child welcomes me. Honestly, I don't know what this means. I mean, I doubt anyone really knows what it means, even regardless of how many theological degrees you have, because Jesus is speaking in metaphors. She's forcing us to use our imaginations. So let's try it. Let's imagine. As we enter into the world of imagination, what about that rainbow? First, God gave us this rainbow as a connection, as a covenant, a relationship with us. And the rainbow is a foreshadowing of Jesus, because Christ herself is the ultimate rainbow, the final divine covenant. And then rainbows today are a symbol of diversity for us. And God is challenging us here to think in bigger, wider ways, to think in 100 languages. So when she says, you see a little child and you see me, what does it mean to be a child? Well, first, the position of a child is one of humility. You're crying. People don't always listen to you. We hear you. And you aren't always the greatest. And you know it, right? When you're young, someone is always picking you up. And when you're older, you still don't have full control over your choices or your bodily autonomy. You have to rely on other people to transport you, to feed you, to take care of you, to help you. Christ emphasizes this when she says, whoever wants to be first must be last and servant of all. And there's also an innocence and a real vulnerability to children. All too often, we're trying to say we're the greatest to cover up our own vulnerability. So maybe Christ is calling us to see her as vulnerable and be vulnerable ourselves. But there's more than just humbleness, innocence, and vulnerability in the world of children. So to understand children more deeply, I like to look at experts, right? And there are some deep theological truths with the experts. Years and years ago, I used to be a Montessori teacher. So I'm going to go to Maria Montessori as one of my first guides. She's sometimes credited with inventing the jungle gym, which actually probably isn't true. But she did refocus the world of education around tactile materials, holistic education, and the idea of education for peace. She viewed children as full of potential, and Christ did the same in her important work of recentering us around the humble child. Montessori also believed in the inherent worth of a child's inherent goodness. She felt that a child is naturally inclined toward empathy, kindness, and cooperation. She saw the good in people. Imagine that we did too. Instead of flipping that person off in traffic, what if we gave them a break? If we saw that people are inherently graceful and full of love and in need of grace and love instead of correction or judgment. Now, my wife, Kirsten, who read today, also introduced me to the ideas of, from a town called Reggio Emilia. It's a town in Italy where important ideas around self-directed experiential learning emerged after World War II. What's fascinating to me about the work of Reggio Emilia is that they have this idea of co-construction, that learning is built and constructed, and education and knowledge is not passively received, but is actively created through collaborative intent and interaction. Relationship is what gives birth to learning. What's fascinating about this is that co-construction is exactly the same term used in process theology to describe God and what we're doing in relationship with God. In process theology, God is involved in a relationship process with us of constantly creating the world. Our creative relationship with God is ever changing. It's not a static relationship. We change, God changes, it becomes this dynamic, ongoing thing. God gently nurtures creation towards goodness, beauty, and complexity, like a good teacher. Human beings, as Reggio Emilia tells us, is true about children. We are active participants in the ongoing creative formation of the world. We are partners with God in the creative process. This is also at the heart of the Reggio Emilia idea. So along with Christ calling us to live in humility, innocence, vulnerability, and being co-constructors of the world, there's also this important idea of Christhood, which is the idea of kenosis. It's a Greek theological word that means the self-emptying of Christ. When I came across this word, I was reminded of a story of a 9-year-old. His family was in an accident, and he had a little 5-year-old sister. And they were both in the hospital, and he just had like, a twisted finger. But his sister was in surgery. She might not live, and they desperately needed a transfusion. And by happenstance, he was the only one in the family who shared the same blood type. So they talked to him and his sister, they talked to him and his parents about whether or not they could get a transfusion from him to help his sister. And he agreed to give her a little bit of his lifeblood to help her get better. He was very calm about it. He said he'd be happy to help in any way he could because he loved her so much. And when they went to attach the blood transfusion needle to him, he said, "All right, I love her a lot. I love you too, Mom and Dad. I hope she gets better. Pray for me. Give her a hug for me when she gets better." And the doctor said, "Well, you'll be right here. You can give her a hug." And the boy opened his eyes and said, I will? Aren't you taking my life to give her life? He thought that he was going to sacrifice everything for her. And of course, he said, of course I will, because I love her. That's kenosis. That is self-emptying. And of course, they explained to him the difference, that he wouldn't be giving up his whole life, just a little bit of blood, but he was willing to do it. You know, that's what it means to be Christ-like, to be able to give up your life for another. So being humble, vulnerable, co-creating the world, willing to give of yourself ultimately to another. So as we think about the child's perspective and what they bring to us, I'd like to go back to Reggio Emilia. Loris Malaguzzi, from that community, wrote a poem that expressed how to see a child's world. And I think it has some deep theological import in it. He wrote, the child has 100 languages, 100 hands, 100 thoughts, 100 ways of thinking, playing, of speaking. The school and the culture, unfortunately, separate the head from the body. They tell the child to think without hands, to do without head, to listen and not to speak, to understand without joy, to love and to marvel only at Easter and at Christmas. They tell the child that work and play, reality and fantasy, science and imagination, sky and earth, reason and dream are things that do not belong together. We are all children at heart. We are all trying to find our way in the world, and the poet was right. All too often we are told to love and marvel here only at Easter and at Christmas. But let us understand that even the small thorn bush by the wayside is aflame with the glory of God. As the scriptures tell us, we are invited to be joyful all the time, to love all the time, to marvel at the profound grace and wonder of God in 100 ways, 100 times a day in all the languages we have. We are invited to come to God as a child, with a child's heart of wonder and interest and curiosity and joy. Now let us promise not to love and marvel only at Easter and Christmas. Let us bring together work and play, reality and fantasy, science and imagination, joy and work. Let us marry reason and dream. Let us not separate things into male and female, but embrace Christ as love, everywhere embodied, in every type of gender. So let us go out into the world today with the teaching of kindness on our tongues. Let us be like the great and wondrous trees that are planted by streams of ever-flowing water. Let us express ourselves in the 100 languages of the rainbow, be curious and humble and vibrant with joy. Let us join that rainbow connection, knowing it as a covenant that brings love into our lives. Amen.
Amen.